The Trump administration has banned former European Union Commissioner Thierry Breton and 4 anti-disinformation campaigners from entering the United States. As commissioner, Breton helped formulate the EU's Digital Services Act, which Washington says unfairly targets U.S. tech giants. The European Commission says it, quote, strongly condemns the decision, and writing on social media, Breton also rejected the accusation behind the entry ban, suggesting the U.S. is engaged in what he called a, quote, witch hunt. David Kaye is a professor of law at the University of California Irvine and a former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression. Welcome to DW. I want to start by getting your reaction to the visa restriction on these 5 European individuals, including that one former commissioner. Does this come as a surprise?
It doesn't come as a surprise at all, actually. I mean, the White House, its allies in Congress, its allies in Silicon Valley have been highly critical of the moves by the European Union in particular to address hate speech, online incitement, disinformation, not only for the past year, but for some time before that. And so the actual bullying that we see in this visa ban, which strikes not only Thierry Breton as a former EU official, but also anti-hate speech campaigners, is clearly an effort to stop Europe from regulating big tech, from regulating the biggest platform. So to that extent, it is not a surprise.
It's interesting because the United States here is trying to change the internal policies of the European Union, including with this legislation that was passed democratically. I want to ask, how much of this is tech bro talk in terms of tech bros driving U.S. policy? Is there any validity to their concerns, to the U.S. concerns, that the EU is overregulating free speech with the Digital Services Act?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I mean, I think it's important first to put this in some context. I mean, the European Union has been struggling for well over a decade with questions of how to deal with online hate and disinformation. They've been struggling with it because, on the one hand, they see this massive power of American, not only American, but largely American, large platforms having this massive influence over their information space. And they've seen time after time the use of that information space, whether it's Facebook or Twitter and now X, or if we want to look at non-American companies like TikTok, we've seen them used by bad actors in order to incite hatred and violence, oftentimes against migrants, oftentimes using these platforms as disinformation places or spaces on topics as sort of broad as climate disinformation to other issues. So this has been a struggle, and Europe has, frankly, been experimenting over time. Some of those experiments probably lean too far into regulating speech, but with the Digital Services Act, the European Union essentially hit on what I think of as an appropriate balance. I mean, essentially, they require the very largest platforms, and only the very largest platforms, to be transparent about their content moderation processes, to examine how they impose risks on public space, how they impose risks on, for example, the proliferation of either illegal content, like incitement to violence, or incitement to terrorism, or child endangerment, or other let's say, lawful but awful content that involves such things as disinformation. They've struggled with how to deal with that, but the DSA essentially says, we need transparency, we need you to consider the risks, and we want to see your work. That has been their approach. It's been an effective approach, but it's an approach that actually requires the platforms to do something. And earlier this month, the EU issued sanctions, basically a penalty against X for its failure to address some of these problems. And that really set off, as you call it, the broligarchy. It set off big tech in very problematic ways. And in part, that led to this visa ban. So this is essentially a response to that, but it's also a response to the possible restriction on big tech and its effort to essentially operate without regulation, to operate essentially lawlessly across Europe.
David Kaye, professor of law at the University of California Irvine, thank you very much for joining us. Let's cross over to our correspondent in Brussels, Teri Schultz, for more. Teri, what has the EU been saying about the visa ban?
Well, in addition to the condemnation which you mentioned, the European Commission just states the obvious, that it will go on making whatever legislation it feels is necessary to protect European Union consumers and companies, which is what it says the Digital Services Act does. But you know, this legislation, Melissa, has been the source of constant friction with the United States from the get-go, and in particular between Thierry Breton, who was Internal Market Commissioner in 2024 when the act was implemented, and Elon Musk, of course, a buddy of U.S. President Donald Trump. The two men feuded openly on X about tech rules, but also about things like Elon Musk's open support for the AfD. Breton would use X to remind U.S. companies they would have to abide by the rules of the DSA, leading Musk one time to tell Thierry Breton that he should go blank his own face. There, I'll save you the beep, Melissa.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what the Digital Services Act actually does and why this U.S. administration is so against it?
Well, it is a massive package of legislation, really groundbreaking, and it seeks to regulate big tech, basically. And of course, most of those major companies reside or have their headquarters in the United States. But it actually regulates all online behavior, and it likes to say that it wants to make what is illegal offline also illegal online. So this relates to, for example, having to take down illegal content quickly once it's identified, having to be transparent about advertising, about online marketing, about algorithms, really just the whole repertoire of what governs online behavior. And the U.S. doesn't like rules being imposed from another place. And so it has always sought to portray the DSA as targeting the U.S., when in fact it simply is where the tech giants live, Melissa.
And any chance the EU will adapt or change its policies on moderating online content as a result of this pressure?
I think there's 0% chance. In fact, the DSA is really just getting rolling. It's issued its first fines just in the last few weeks, Melissa, and that is more than 120 million euros against X. This is because, for example, X went from having these blue ticks next to someone's name, mean that those people have been verified users, to simply selling that. The EU says that that's deceptive. It also is not transparent about its advertising repository. It doesn't share the proper data with researchers. So X is the proud recipient of the first fines under DSA. TikTok, on the other hand, was also under investigation and chose to become more compliant with the rules. So you can see that not everyone is going to act the same way that X does.
It'll be very interesting to see what the United States does in terms of the additional instruments and pressure it can put to bear. Now, what are the 4 other people that have been banned? Tell us a little bit more about them.
That's right, and it's good that you brought that up, because the European Commission says that it is looking into what else might happen and that it may seek to take action to preserve its regulatory autonomy, Melissa. So we'll just have to see if anything else comes of this particular announcement. The other 4 people are all counter-disinformation activists. So it's quite rich that the U.S. says that these measures are being imposed for censorship when the people that it's being imposed on are actually working to take down unfair and untrue content off the internet. 2 of them are from the UK and 2 of them are from Germany. And one of the women who's been targeted publishes what's called the Global Disinformation Index, a ranking where disinformation seems to be running high. And the US, once again, doesn't like that.
Teri Schultz in Brussels, thank you very much for those insights.